Welcome to QB Connect. I'm Darin Slack, your host, with my son Michael Slack. How are you, Michael?
Doing great.
Very good. I want to talk to you today about something that's really important. It's been on my mind the last couple of weeks, and it's related to this QB crisis, this collegiate quarterback crisis that I'm seeing between the nature of the increasing demand on quarterbacks at the collegiate level and the reduction in the supply of quality quarterbacks. Now, does that make sense to you when I say that?
Yeah, I mean, with NIL and the 12-team playoff, and there's a lot of expectations that are being built around, hey, my school's got a shot, and you need to perform. And that kind of goes down from the trickle down of like whatever happens in the NFL goes down to college and so on. It's like Tom Brady kind of ruined it for everybody, being as successful as he was in two places, right? So like he was successful obviously with the Patriots, but then going in his first year with the Bucs winning so it's like there's an expectation that if you're a good or great quarterback that you're able to perform at that highest level year in and year out. And these NIL transfers and guys that are going to these different places in 1 year are expected to perform at their best every single game.
I think the part of the problem is the nature of what's happening in the NFL is coming into the collegiate ranks. You've got a number of young quarterbacks, Anthony Richardson, Mac Jones, Trey Lance. There's like 7 or 8 of them today on Twitter that were indicated that they've all been benched. Bryce Young. I mean, Justin Fields is struggling. Yeah. You got all these
Will
names.
Levis.
Right. All these names. And they're saying NFL has a quarterback development problem. Well, when you play the younger guy, it's going to be a challenge. Well, in college, you've got kids coming up that are 18, 19 years old. They haven't even experienced the violence of a collegiate game, the pressure, the expectations. And now with the parity brought about by the portal, I mean, the SEC every week is any given Saturday, right? They could win.
And I think it's like the jump in expectation from high school to Division I, SEC, Big Ten football versus Big Ten to NFL in terms of the expectation of the fan base and stuff like that is way bigger from high school to Division I. Because like you're going from, at most like 10,000 people to 100,000 people in some stadiums, plus millions of people watching, in the expectation and history of these programs versus what you were in high school, versus you go from those national stages, and in some cases, like in the NFL, you're going down a little bit, going from like Alabama to Carolina, right? So it's like it's I think it's a different jump where these players have to mature really, really fast.
And I think that's the crisis I'm talking about, is that there are 15 to 20 kids right now that no matter where they play, they're mercenary, high octane, NIL, made for the NIL world type quarterbacks. And then you've got everybody else. And that's kind of always going to be that case, right? In the NFL, you've always got about 12 to 15 guys that are really good, and the rest are trying to keep up. And that's
I think some coaches would argue 5.
Okay,
well, like 5, but like, yeah,
I'm being nice.
It gets pretty steep at the top for sure.
So when I say crisis, I'm referring to the fact that the NIL's not going anywhere. That's needed to happen a long time ago. We need to pay the players. I'm for that, actually, not because I think it's, going to ruin the spirit of the game. That was happening before, just under the table.
Yeah, and it needed to happen.
Right.
It's like,
you got billions of dollars coming in.
Yeah.
We need to reward the kids, that are earning this money for the NCAA. Regulation, I'm sure there's ways to regulate it, but that's above my pay grade. I don't know. But I like to see what's happening because a lot of these kids are using that money for good. I mean, they're turning around, helping their teammates, helping out community, family. I love all that. At the end of the day, money was always going to come down there. The business was going to seep down into the collegiate ranks. And now it's even in the high school ranks. But when you look at it from a quarterback development standpoint, boy, the development of a player has to really change.
Yeah, it's never been more necessary
right.
in such a pressurized time frame.
Yeah, there's a comment I use, in my life. It's kind of like a novelty versus a necessity. In the past, what I did was a novelty. It was kind of like specialized training for quarterbacks. So that's kind of novel if you can do that. Well, now you got to have it because the necessity related to what a kid's going to face, no matter what level he's playing at. I mean, I've been watching some lower level games. You got schools that are constantly trying to get into that FBS environment. They're moving up through the ranks out of FCS and the others, and they're looking for players who can meet the rising demand as signal callers. NFL rises and falls on a quarterback and a good defense. I mean, if you have a good defense and no quarterback, you're going to probably make the divisional playoffs at the best. You got a great quarterback, you got a chance to win it all. We're seeing that with Mahomes. We're seeing that with the teams that have all played great. I believe that's going to happen at the collegiate ranks. If you don't have a great quarterback, it's the same business model.
Well, I think it's always been that way to a certain extent in the national championship level, but now it's seeping down into more teams because more teams have a shot.
Exactly. The parity is increasing. Every Saturday now, you're watching SEC teams battle it out, and it's like, wow. I mean, we thought they weren't going to be any good, and now they're good. Even Vanderbilt with Diego Pavia is doing special things, when they want to. It depends on who they play. They play Ball State, they play down to them, and they play Texas, they play up. I think at the end of the day, what we have to look at as developers is what are we doing to contribute to the development process. I mean, back in the day, there was only a handful of us, the early adopters, and now there's a quarterback trainer in every city or multiple in every city, and that's great. It's great for the game because the demand is so great for the position, but the supply's not there. Now, that doesn't mean that what we're doing is going to guarantee that a kid's going to get there, but it certainly helps. I mean, you got kids, I think of Drew Aller, right now at Penn State. He wouldn't be there if he didn't have Brad Mendler, who worked with him. He's one of our guys that we were friends with for many years. Love what Brad's done with him and a number of other guys. You got Will Hewlett in Jacksonville doing what he's doing with Brock Purdy and Anthony Richardson. I don't think those guys get where they are, even at the point where they are right now, if they don't have him working with them at the skill set he has.
Right.
And there's a number of others that I could name that are doing similar excellent things. So I'm not really talking about the event-based development where you're giving the kid his due because he's successful. I mean, I love what the Elite 11 does for great players and giving them the stage to say, hey, congratulations, you have earned the spot to be here and to be recognized for what you've done. That's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
I'm talking about the unseen guy that nobody knows really exists that's behind the scenes with that kid when he's in 8th grade, 9th grade, on the back of a schoolyard or in the backyard of a field, and they're throwing the ball and they're getting to know each other. It's what you do every day. You're getting to know a guy and you're creating something out of this moldable clay, if you will. And I want to talk about that because that is going to set the stage for increasing the supply to the demand.
And I think, to kind of put that to the forefront is that unseen time is the most necessary time in any quarterback's development across the board. You look at a guy like Joe Burrow and what he recommends to players is get off, the social media, stop posting and just get to work. The transition that he made from his first year at LSU to his second year, he had the talent and the ability, but the work that he put in that offseason going into that national championship year wasn't necessarily like everyone saw what he was doing. He just did it, and he put that time in. When you look at guys now, and the reason why I think it's so important that it's not seen is that if you're putting yourself in a situation where your development has to be seen, you're only thinking about how good or bad you look versus am I actually getting better at the things that I need to get better at to be the player that can handle this pressure, that can handle the expectation, that can handle the adversity that you're going to go through in a football season.
Right. So let's be clear right up front. There is nothing a quarterback trainer can do for a kid who isn't willing to be the player he wants to be on his own.
Zero.
And if there isn't any talent, there's nothing the quarterback developer is going to be able to do to draw something magical out of that athlete,
right,
to put them in a position.
There's only so far that you can take a kid from, there's only so far you can move the needle.
Right. And we're needle movers. We are, but within a scope of reality. And I think that's something we've had to accept over the years is that we are extending careers through what we do. I mean, many kids are overachievers and they're doing well and they play well through high school, and the reality truck stops at college.
I think for us, like where we would say like our best examples of our help are kids that you would never hear of because they go from, hey, you probably shouldn't be on a football field to, hey, you're playing college football somewhere. And that's like Division III or NAIA. Yeah, there's a level of that transition is kind of things that we would be most proud of as coaches, not necessarily stuff that you would see, taking a kid that has no talent to a Division I level. That I don't know that happens.
Right. kid has to certainly show up with the goods on some level for it to be a reality. Some of it's genetic, some of it's just God-given, some of it's just their makeup, where they grew up, what have you. We've seen kids that have developed late. In other words, I think you say the point, they aren't until they are.
Yeah. It's you're not D1 until you are D1. And that's so that kids don't get discouraged by hearing like, hey, if right now you're 5'3", a $120 and you haven't hit your growth spurt yet, that now you're out of it. It's the idea of you're not until you are, and you don't know if and when that's going to happen. So there are some kids that they develop really late. Like I think one that we would talk about is like Fernando Mendoza at Cal.
Right. He's a young man that we trained. I trained him since he was in 8th grade, all the way up until just before his junior year. He switched schools, which I thought was a good move. He went from a less competitive program to a state championship program and competed his way into a starting role. Now, he was ready for that environment. I think his intelligence and his work ethic, and I think his burgeoning skill
he has a personal
set,
intensity to him that,
right.
that he brings.
I don't think anybody saw that until he got into that environment and was able to respond to it. He was going to Yale, and that kind of fell through, and then Cal kind of came late, which really wasn't expected. Somebody saw something there, and now he's playing very well for what he's doing there and doing some great things. I think he would be an anomaly in the sense that, he's really excelled beyond what I think anybody gave him credit for. Most kids who are touted, from the beginning, I think there's a certain, swath of 1%ers that are in that. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about their development and what goes on for them. We've worked with a handful of them over the years, and one of the things we found is that, it's not so much a mechanical conversation. It's about being able to engage the athlete and make a connection with them where they best learn. I mean, because not every athlete learns the same. They don't process the same. So when you're talking about a 1%er, a guy like Julian Lewis up in Georgia, or a guy who's already, got multiple offers and you're working with them, you're really trying to figure out what the greatest needs are and try to slot in where you can. And some of that may be mental, some of that may be emotional, some of it may be physical. Mechanical, usually not so much at that point, right?
Yeah. So like when you get into the higher echelon, like the details matter, but the consistency isn't always necessarily a mechanical failure. There's a lot of factors that go into it on any given day. So what you're trying to build is a foundational level for a quarterback that they can sustain success in, regardless of who they're playing and what the situation, requires of them.
When I was had the opportunity a couple of years back to train Matt Flynn before he was at LSU, and I wasn't really training Matt Flynn. I was actually working with another player who was going to LSU as a guest of someone else, and Matt came out for the workout. And it was really interesting just to be there because Matt kind of hovered. He wanted to see what we were doing. And it was interesting because Matt threw a beautiful ball. There was no question. I mean, we played catch, and it was very difficult to find anything that was wrong because he hit everything right on the nose, just boom, boom, boom. But there was little things that I could see that, I asked him questions about. I kind of questioned him and just threw out some ideas, and they seemed to connect with him. Just, hey, try this, see if it works. There's something about athletes that are like that are always looking for an advantage. He hovered. He wanted to be around it. He just wanted to see what was there so he could gain an advantage. He wasn't even the guy being trained, but he was willing to submit to the guy who was there just to learn something, to get an advantage, just to get an edge. I think that's the kind of makeup of great players, is that they just want to be around coaching.
They're going to get better regardless of who they're around.
Right.
And they can recognize stuff as beneficial because they're going to try it.
Right. And he had the athleticism.
Give it a shot.
He had the athleticism to try something new that he didn't do before. Just to be able to switch on the fly and say, I did it this way before, now I can feel myself doing it a new way. That's not normal for the average athlete, because you change the grip on a kid, he freaks out. It just, the ball flutters and it goes bad. It wasn't even an issue for him. He just tried something new and it worked.
I think those players, and just something that comes to mind, is they're able to separate relationship from mechanics, meaning that some guys hold on to mechanics because their personal coach told them that, or even dad told them that. It's like, hey, I'm going to hold on to these mechanics because this is the way it's done, because this coach told me that this is how it's done, versus guys that are really talented, that have real ability. They're willing to try different stuff because it's more in them. It's more innate in that it's their throw. It's their, like, they own that throw. So, hey, I'll try that. And if it doesn't work, they'll stay with what works, but they have the willingness to try something at least once to see if it's beneficial for them.
Well, there's an identity that comes with success. And I think a lot of young athletes, because they don't possess a confidence outside of the game, they get a little bit nervous. And if anybody messes with what their system is, they get uncomfortable because they built an identity not only through what they do or how they do it, but the people that influence them to do it. And so when you challenge that, they suddenly feel it's a threat to the whole construct. Guys like Matt Flynn, guys that are, top end players, guys that played at the high levels, they don't operate like that. They have something outside of football that sustains them. This is not their life. They actually have a life outside of the game, and they're able to come into the game with a very kind of, they almost don't care. I mean, they care, but they don't. There's bigger issues in play here, and I've seen that. I mean, they're incredibly competitive. I think when you're working with top 1% athletes, the more competition you can put them in, the better, because they want to get better through the context of understanding how they do things. Now, the reality is that we're not going to have the chance to work with, competitive athletes like that, or automatic Division I type players, or kids that are already at Division I levels. But I think when you're working with those players, creating a competitive environment, creating an environment where they set the pace is really important, because that ownership is important for change. In other words, they're not going to change anything they don't own. In other words, they're throwing and asking questions of us, and we're just giving feedback as we're able. The less you talk, the better in those environments.
Yeah, I think when you're working with those kind of players, it's more about putting them in situations to potentially fail, and then provide feedback as they are searching for it, or give them the space to work it out, right? So, but you're creating a context in which they have to try and do something at a higher level, or something that they might not be as good at, to where they got to develop from there. They can't just stay the same, or else it's not going to look very good or feel very good.
It's very true with NFL quarterbacks. When I worked with a few of them, you find the same exact thing. It's, you let the quarterback come to you for the training. You don't push your ideas. You don't need to talk. You need to be very careful where you insert, because they have their process, and you got to learn what that process is, and you got to be able to ease into it with questions and connection that they appreciate, not resent because you're speaking of things that put them on blast or on the defensive. When you get younger quarterbacks, guys that are in the development mode, it's the reverse. You become the process by which they get where they're going to go. So this is where it becomes incumbent upon any developer, recognizing that a kid's going to be under pressure. You kind of create some of that pressure, don't you?
Right. Like, you have to put, now pressure doesn't necessarily mean that you're yelling at them and trying to create a hyper intensive situation. It's more about that, again, you're looking for the potential pitfalls that they're going to come in through a season, and you're helping them work through that from a mental standpoint, where they can self-correct and be able to process on their own, versus having to rely on, hey, I need coach to tell me what I did wrong, or what I need to do here. They're learning how to navigate these things through tools that we give them, that we are working them through, but they got to own that.
Well, let's talk about some of those tools. I think those are important to this development of increasing the supply to meet the demand, right? We've tried to do this for many, many years. We've been at this 37 years, and there's lots of options out there. My concern with a lot of those options now is that they're becoming, once again, mechanics heavy. They're becoming preoccupied with exposure that kids aren't ready for yet. They haven't been hidden away long enough to develop themselves, and they're collapsing under the pressure. And so they're going back to their coaches, who are giving them the same results and the same answers they've been getting for years. My point is, it's not wrong to have a developer. It's just that guy has to continue to develop himself. Mm-hmm. We as the coaches have to keep getting better, right? So one of the things we try to emphasize in what we do is we talk about the first and most important thing is you got to know your why. I think that's probably the biggest mistake I think is being made, is that kids' why is they love the game of football, and I think loving the game of football is great. I think that's a starting point. But if football is your only thing, that's a problem, right?
Yeah, I think maybe, like, you could put it like, they go as deep as their what, not the why.
Okay.
The what is, I get to play football. I get to do this thing. I get to, I get to be around friends. There's a what, there's a context that they enjoy, but they never go deeper than that into what actually motivates them, what helps them to get up in the morning, what drives them internally beyond the context that they're in. Like Tom Brady, he was going to be successful in whatever he did. Football was just a context that got to be exposed to that. But I'm sure he's going to do great and get better in the broadcasting booth. But the idea is, it's not the context that matters. And that's where the why comes in, that I don't think people get beyond the what.
Right. They don't know the reason. And the reason's got to go bigger than just the game. It's got to get into your connection to the players, to the team, your own personal motivations, why you do what you do. And we cover all that. I think that's an important thing, is to have that conversation and provide tools for the athlete to discern and self-discover what those things are. Because an athlete who knows his why plays with more confidence, even when the game's going south on him or he's not hot. I think an athlete is able to overcome adversity better when he has a better why. The second thing I think that's really important, just to cover these quickly, is kids have to understand that the same goal that they have on the field is the same goal they have in their life. We've always emphasized this, and I don't think it's emphasized enough, is that you must be committed to getting first downs. And first downs is really the only focus a quarterback should have. We always use the joke that if you get first downs, you run out of grass, they give you points.
Right.
And that's the way it always is going to be, and never going to change. In other words, it's this incremental improvement that must exist on the field and in your life. In other words, it's the exact mirror of getting first downs on the field and getting first downs in life. Every day I train, every day I build relationships. You don't throw, Hail Marys on holidays with your mom. You got to build that relationship every day, or your girlfriend or whoever. You got to build that relationship every day. You got to get first down.
I think a quick example of that from a practical standpoint for like throwing would be an example here, is that the guys that are elite throwers have elite habits. They put themselves in situations where their focus is on, like, so in throwing, the guys that I work with at the collegiate level, that one of the biggest things that I need that they come back with in terms of mechanical errors is, I ask them, is like, hey, what's your warm-up process like? What are the things that you do to get yourself ready to throw? And they usually come out, I don't really have one. It's like, that's the first thing that you need to start to develop, is like, hey, are you doing arm care? Are you doing like practice field throwing, like with a towel or with weighted balls? Are you getting your body prepared to be able to throw? And then when you pick up the ball, what are you doing? Do you have drills that get you ready to get certain feels dialed in? Or are you just picking it up and chucking it? There's habits that you put in place that help you to move the chains, so that you do that every single day. Well, you're going to move the chains. Like you're going to start to see development because of the habits that you're putting in place.
I think that's really good. I think that having good habits transfers over into the way they eat, the way they physically train in the weight room, the way they handle their academics. I mean, it's elite habits make elite players. So I think, moving the chains and having the willingness to do the hard work and the perseverance to keep getting better, that one little 2% every day will put a kid in a different zip code of opportunity than the guy who does it in large leaps. Okay. I think the last thing we talk about, and again, we're just limiting how much we do here, but I want to give people a general sense of what I think is important, and that is, we have to talk to them about passion. Not just the passion of the emotion of playing the game, but it goes into their why, but it has to go deeper than that. It goes into their understanding of what they're willing to go through for someone else. Passion, as a Latin root, is the idea of passio. It's the original word, which means to suffer for something you love. It actually has a religious connotation. It means the sufferings of Christ. But more than that, I think that what we're looking at here is the definition of what an athlete's willing to put himself through for those he claims to care about on his team. And we isolate that as a really high-level motivation for where athletes are going. That's been our mantra for 37 years.
Probably arguably the most important thing that we emphasize in camps, because football is going to end at some point, but passion is something that we want them to carry through the rest of their lives, not just in the game of football.
I think that's the whole man message that we talk about. Is we're not talking about it from the standpoint of hype quotes and weight room cliches. We're really getting into the heart of what are you really saying you're willing to do when the chips are down. And this Passio concept is deep. There's no question about it. Everybody's confronted by it. I'm confronted by it, and even doing this. I think every person alive has to deal with the level of what they're willing to go through for those they care about. And I think that's a decision. With NIL, with people who are more surface focused than ever, in other words, money and things like that, there's got to be a deeper why, a deeper motivation for why I do what I do. And I can't think of anything better than deciding to love my teammates through sacrifice as a better motivation.
And I think that connection piece is really important. I think you see guys that are in it for the money. I think there are some kids that use the money as a context to be able to help their family, but their family is their why.
Exactly.
Like the reason why they work so hard and do the things that they need to do in order to be a successful football player is so they can provide for their family. That's deeper than the game of football. It's deeper than the funds that you're getting from playing the game of football. That's going to keep them going when things aren't going the way that they want them to.
I don't think any money is ever going to be the thing that the guys are playing for. I mean, once you have it, now your motivation begins to care for those that you care about, right? You give it to those you care about. So I hear stories about guys doing stuff for their offensive line, doing stuff for their families, doing stuff for their moms. I mean, they're showing their why with the money they're being given. So the NIL simply reveals the motivation. It's, oh, yeah, we're the bling, whatever. But push comes to shove, what motivates a person, the hard wiring of an individual, will never be only the money. It
Right.
can't, because there's no connection at that point. We were made for love and connection. That's the way it works. And so I think for many of these young men, that's a bit of a touchy-feely concept that may not be common in the discussion, but I think is to our peril that we ignore it, because a lot of young men aren't willing to be that vulnerable and talk about what they really care about. I think deep down, a lot of kids are very emotional about this opportunity, and I don't think they are given enough opportunity to have that conversation. I'm not suggesting we become counseling coaches, and we're not wired for that. That's above our pay grade. But I think some knowledge of how boys tick into becoming men and understanding that process, the innate desire to provide and protect, the innate desire to be a passionate warrior that does things that are exceptional for the benefit of another, that's hardwired in. And so we've got to create an environment for how that can work. And I talk about those things at our camp, and I think that sets up the mechanics thing that you're good at, and talk about now how you weave that into what they're going to do, which is the most hard thing they're going to do, and that's change.
Yeah, I think that goes to like your goal, like what is your ultimate purpose in what you're doing. There was a funny moment I had with Jane, my daughter, the other day, is that I didn't let her do something. It's like, Dad, you're making my life harder right now. It's not easy right now. I'm like, that's okay. The goal isn't easy. It's for connection. What I asked you to do was it's harder, but it helps us stay more connected. The way that you're communicating with me right now isn't helpful for our connection, or the way that you're communicating with Mom. And I think that goes with everything that a quarterback's doing as it relates to the how hard it is to be consistent, how hard it is to do mechanic stuff, how hard it is to get up in the morning to do weight room stuff, how hard it is to do these things. It's going to be harder. It's going to make your life harder. But what's your goal? Is your goal to gratify, the fame and all that stuff that you want, or is there something deeper in the connection to your teammates, to your family, that is driving you in that? And I think that's what pushes us to create a environment for change, is that I'm okay with the difficulty of changing because my mindset is on something that's further out, not on what's easiest.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think the athlete having that basis for connection. But let's go one step further, because it's one thing to say, yeah, all the lovey-dovey stuff is great, but what makes us so effective and our hearts so effective in what we do is that we're not only able to talk about the why that's going on in their hearts, we can do it in the mechanics as well, which now really settles a problem within a lot of athletes. And that is, I don't know why this is happening in my throwing, and I don't know how to fix it. And there's nothing like a good solution to help a kid feel better about what he's doing.
Yeah, like to help build confidence in a player is they have to see the failure, try something that helps them to change it, and own that success to where when it happens, or if it happens again, they can make the adjustment. And you do that over the course of over games, over, several sessions, stuff like that, they start to be able to understand and own their own throw. And you can't own your own throw unless you have options. And so from a mechanic standpoint, if they've only been told one thing and they have no other option, they're not making decisions. And that's really the important part in this process, is they have to make intentional decisions to either stay with what they're doing or to make a change. And that's what coaches need to facilitate. So putting them in a situation where, hey, try this mechanic here and see if it makes a difference. And if it's too difficult or they can't do it or they don't like it, they're making an intentional decision, which reinforces what they were doing before, which might be a good thing. It's not necessarily always a bad thing when they don't do the thing that you asked them to do. It just reinforces their confidence in the thing that they were doing before, that, hey, this is the way that I want to be able to do it so that I can be successful.
I think one of the things that is very important when you're talking to an athlete about change is you got to provide a bridge. In other words, the explanation for why they're supposed to do the thing you want can't just be, hey, just try this. There has to be a compelling argument, a compelling reason why I'm going to do this thing, because I'm not going to give up what I'm doing that's been successful or marginally successful to try what you want. If there isn't first the connection.
Yeah, well, there has to be a why.
There's got to be a little bit of trust.
Yeah.
There's got to be the trust. That's great. But I've seen a lot of great guys that couldn't coach their way to a wet paper bag because they don't know what to apply when. They say everything they know, which we did it back in the day. We said everything we knew. We thought that's how you build connection. No, you build connection to the highest need in the athlete. And you know that within the first 5 minutes of talking to him. You've got to talk to the athlete and figure out what his highest needs are and meet them. That provides a beginning of trust, kind of like what I said with Matt Flynn. I was able to identify some high needs that he had that had nothing to do with his mechanics. Maybe it's validation. Maybe it's challenge or competition. His is competition. Whatever it is, you got to identify the need the player has and get in that environment with him. Once you do that, now you're going to suggest something. Let's talk a little bit about something that would be a potential problem. Let's talk about accuracy, because accuracy, timing, and decision-making are probably the three biggest separators at any level for a quarterback. In other words, hit what you're aiming at, even when you're moving. So what are some of the non-negotiables that you would be going into to try to help a kid increase his accuracy?
So one of the primary things is what cue do they have to be able to get the ball from point A to point B? So, for example, when I throw, the only thing that I'm thinking about is where I'm snapping my wrist. So, hey, I'm going to snap my wrist to that spot, and that's where that ball is going to go. Having a simplistic or simple but effective cue that you have is going to affect accuracy, because if you're thinking about multiple things or you don't know what to process, then it's going to affect how consistent you are. And if you're not consistent, you're not going to be accurate.
Now, you say where I snap my wrist. That's an important point. A lot of guys, it just matters where I snap it. Well, it isn't just snapping the wrist, it's where you snap it in the process of throwing the ball. So,
and how,
extension is kind of the thing.
And how you flex your wrist versus just pronating.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of feel nuances within that. Hey, just snap your wrist. I mean, that some kids are doing, more of a supination versus pronation, or they're taking bad angles or whatever. They get more flat, they're more over the top, whatever. All those nuances start to play a role, don't they?
Well, going into even that, their grip is going to affect how they snap. And when I say snap, so sometimes the supination is actually more beneficial based off of the grip that they have versus pronation.
So you would change the release of the wrist versus the grip.
So yeah, so it's easier to change sometimes how they snap versus just changing the grip, because the grip is really fundamental in how they feel about their throw. It's a very difficult thing.
So you got to know the kid.
Yeah, like there has to be a relationship there built. And usually if you ask them to change the grip, it better work within the first 2 or 3 throws, or else you go back. Because
well, that's a good point. I mean, if you're talking about making the change on something so fundamental, that feel just rocks a kid's mental and emotional.
But there's some kids you have to change their grip because they can't throw a spiral to save their life. So it's like going to the biggest need. If a kid can't throw something that resembles a spiral in 10 throws, then you got to adjust something, right? And so grip would be one of the most fundamental things there. So unless that's happening, you wouldn't change their grip, because it wouldn't necessarily affect their accuracy. But in terms of the accuracy, how and where they snap and kind of what they're doing in terms of power. So if it's accuracy, is it that they can't get the ball from there distance wise? Well, then that's a power issue. That's not an accuracy issue. But if within 10 yards, they can't hit a guy within their frame, well, that's an accuracy issue that is determined by where and how they're snapping, because there's nothing down the barrel of the throw that's helping them to keep it in the spot that they want to actually go.
Now, if you take age into account, now you're talking about power structures that aren't even developed yet. So now you're talking about as much as you can get at this point in their development, right?
Yeah. So like with young kids, any level of consistency is going to be beneficial for accuracy. Because going back to, like, if you're not consistent, you're not going to be accurate. If you can't repeat the skill. So in terms of the movement itself, if you can't do something that resembles the same thing over and over and over again, you're not going to be accurate. It's like if I had a gun that changed out of the barrel, like somewhere every time I shot it. It doesn't matter how good I am in terms of my sight and kind of where I'm aiming it. If I can't feel where it's coming out consistently, I'm not going to be an accurate thrower or an accurate shooter.
So basically, depending on how well they established the core non-negotiables of the throw, in other words, how they generate ground force, how they generate rotation, deceleration and extension, through the throw, how they start, how they stop. If they're doing all that pretty well, then the adjustments become smaller in the arm path.
Yeah, so it goes from, and I will say this, especially when it comes with younger kids, it's big to small. Usually there are things that are bigger things, like, hey, how is your pre-pass position? How is your finish position? Like, are you doing the general big swath cuts of, like, hey, can you like make this look kind of like a throw? And then it gets more detailed as they get better and more proficient with it.
So that becomes a decision. Each workout has its own decision process of how much you're going to engage that. And I think that's where the crisis comes, is because as we have this accelerated demand of, I got to have quarterbacks now that can do this, there is a process to getting kids to improve. And so on a Tuesday at 3:00, you're only going to get a kid to move so far. That needle's only going to move so far. And over a 6-month period, you're only going to see it so far. So there is a timeline here that we got to be honest about.
Yeah, and that's where you have to bring up the consistency of the habits, right? Like,
there you go.
Because if you're not consistent, you're not going to have accelerated change. That's the only way that you create accelerated change, is through consistency and the habits that they're trying to work through. The guys that make the most change are the ones that are sometimes almost to a detriment, like, hey, coach, I'm doing this, and this. And it's like, hey, you need to back off because you're in a danger of overuse stuff. So it's like there's a level of pushing and consistency of thought into what they're trying to do that creates accelerated change.
So for a young quarterback, the priority to develop him would be, you got to do whatever you do consistently. You got to do whatever you do with intention, whether that be nutrition, learning to have a work ethic, and your mechanics. Throw a lot of balls, not a few. Got to throw a lot of balls. And you got to self-discover. I mean, these are habits you develop from a young age, from the age of 9, 10, 11, that now by the time he's 12, 13, and he can start to manipulate some of these things, he's already got the good work ethic already in place.
Yeah, and not losing the main thing in terms of mechanics. Mechanics should do specific things. Throw it harder, throw it farther, be more accurate. It's not a beauty contest. And that's where I think you can get into a trouble as a coach, is you start to coach to the aesthetic versus the functionality of what they're doing. Like I've seen it happen with guys that a kid can throw the ball 60 yards and they work with the mechanics guy, and now they can't throw it over 50, but it looks more like what the coach is trying to get him to do. And unfortunately, you lose the functionality of what they're trying to do from a throwing standpoint.
Well, we experienced some of that. I'm not going to lie. We've had kids that they had this mindset that they did what we thought we wanted them to do, and it wasn't that we wanted them to throw less. It's just they became enamored with a particular idea. We get credit for those guys as much as the guys that are getting better. I think there's something to be said for knowing the right button to push at the right time in the development of a player to get to the next level. And I think that's where the wisdom of quarterback development has got to really step up. I'm not talking about quarterback coaching at a high school or a youth program. I'm talking about outside quarterback development where you have camps, programs. And I think camps are great for creating an experience and creating a jump start, an ignition of all these things, which is what we can provide, and there's others too. But the ongoing input of a trusted quarterback developer can really accelerate those habits that you're talking about that put a kid in a position to meet the demands. The crisis is not going away. I mean, the fact that a young man who is 14, 15 years old is already faced with the expectations of a high school, that's great. But the minute he steps into a college campus, he has the aspirations of playing at a high level. He's going to have to really make a leap that many young men aren't prepared for. And I think the kinds of things we're talking about are going to be helpful. I think another thing that's really important when you're talking about this is we have to be willing to be honest about where kids' fit is going to be. It's like, you're not there yet.
Yep.
That's one thing we've always tried to tell a kid. It's kind of like, well, where do you see me playing in college? I'm like, right now I don't. I think that is an honesty that they need, because without that honesty, the kid doesn't understand what he has to commit to. He won't make that next step to the next level. So there is this trade-off between the hope that we sell, and the fact that, hey, you're just not there yet, and we're not trying to be mean. We're just saying, we're not. So what you have is you got a lot of kids at the high school level that are competing for a job that don't understand why they aren't getting the chance. And it was something you said to them when they were 11 that they haven't paid attention to. You've been telling them for 3 years, you've got to work your feet, and they won't work their feet. And what ends up being the problem is their happy feet in the huddle, or their happy feet in the pocket, I should say. Something you pointed 2 years ago that they wouldn't spend the time on, that you've been pointing. The dad may even know. It's kind of like, I know, you've been telling him, he still won't listen. I mean, I can't tell you how many times that happened. You tried to get a kid to understand something and he won't go there. We can't make an athlete do what he doesn't want to do.
Yeah, and that's where the relationship has to be the main thing that allows you to be able to have that honesty and get to the crux of the matter.
I don't know that even that the honesty was going to produce the outcome I wanted.
Well, it's not just the honesty, but having that conversation
right,
where you're getting into, okay, so why is he not doing it?
It didn't always result in a kid being willing to do it, but there was some knockdown dragouts, I got to tell you, because, it was fish or cut bait time. It's kind of like, if we don't make this change, it's not going to happen, But I still believe that every athlete has a ceiling in their talent set. And I mean, there is. And so we're trying to help them push through that ceiling to get as far along as they can. And some of them just can't risk having something be deficient in their mechanics. Hence the point we have made throughout this entire time is that the crisis is not only in the absence of the supply, but the crisis is in the mind of the athlete. In other words, they're not crossing over into that decision they have to make to do the hard thing early, to make the commitment to do the good elite habits. They're not willing to do the eating. They're not willing to do the training. I've seen kids, they'll do all that you ask except the one thing.
Right.
The one thing they have to do, eat, they won't eat. They won't get in the weight room. They won't make the change mechanically. It's almost as if they feel like I've done everything you've asked, I'm not going to do that. And it's kind of like, it's sad because you can see that they're going to hit the wall at some point. It's not going to get done.
Yeah. And unfortunately, most of those guys find out too late. But not all find out too late. Some of them find out right when they need to, but it usually comes with that rock bottom or failure where it's like,
or they come back at college and say, I should have listened to you.
Yeah.
Help me.
I should have listened. But sometimes in that situation where, like they end up figuring it out and they still have an opportunity and they still make the most of it. Right. And so I think that's an important note, is that even if you find out and it's later than you want it to be, it doesn't mean you're done. Like you still have the opportunity to make that change. And so don't just give up because you identify that, hey, I should have listened at this point.
Yeah, I think that's important. There's no magic pill. There's no magic fairy dust you can spread and a kid's going to get there. But you're right. Injuries, circumstances can change, and very quickly kids can be thrust into an opportunity.
I think going into the quarterback crisis stuff that we're talking about is that the way that it's resolved is you have a bunch of guys that don't give up. You have a bunch of quarterbacks that they're going to fail because they're not ready. And this is what's going to happen in the NFL is you have guys that aren't ready right now. It was too early, but if they don't give up, if they keep working, keep developing, and keep having the mindset to persevere through this, it'll come back around. And this is where having resources and people that they go to that are going to help them work through that is so important in this. Is that the only way that you fix that crisis is through guys that aren't willing to just quit.
That's really good. That's a great one to end on. I think we need to understand that we're not talking about being the only solutionaries in this process. There are lots of great coaches out there that have a heart to have every athlete succeed, but ultimately it's up to you as the player to decide whether how far you want this to go. Do you want to be that guy that's going to get there? And Michael, I think that's what we're faced with is that, do the young men today want to stay in the process? Do they have the perseverance? And ultimately, I hope for you, young man, as you're watching this, that you realize there's no simple solution. You're going to have to go places you probably never thought you'd have to be successful. And for the developer out there, I would tell you, make sure you're continuing to do all you can to avail yourself to the best training that's out there and the best teaching that's out there to give you the tools that are going to help you be a continuing trustworthy source for the athlete to come to for improvement. I think all the phases of development are in need of improvement because the demand is great and the crisis isn't going anywhere. So thanks for joining us today on this podcast. Michael, thanks for being here today. And we hope you'll join us next time on the QB Connect podcast.